In the Imperium of man, glory is a currency measured in monuments, banners, and the names of heroes etched into stone. Most Space Marines are raised to embody that ideal, to be symbols, icons, living weapons whose presence alone inspires awe and terror. But there is a legion for whom glory is not only irrelevant, but dangerous. A legion taught that visibility is a weakness, that recognition is a liability, and that survival itself often depends on erasing every trace of their existence. They are the Raven Guard, and their story is not one of triumph, but of slow, deliberate erasure. From the very beginning, the Raven Guard were never meant to shine. They were shaped to move where light cannot reach, to strike where no one is looking, and to leave behind nothing but unanswered questions. Their victories are measured not in cheers, but in silences, worlds saved without ever knowing how close they came to annihilation. In a galaxy that glorifies overwhelming force, the Raven Guard perfected something far more unsettling, the art of making war invisible. And in doing so, they paid a price few others could endure. To understand the twisted life of the Raven Guard, one must first accept a brutal truth of the 41st millennium. The Imperium does not reward mercy, subtlety, or restraint. It survives through excess, excessive violence, excessive sacrifice, excessive devotion. The Raven Guard, however, fight against that current even as they serve it. They kill efficiently, quietly, often sparing millions by eliminating thousands. Yet this efficiency isolates them. Their wars end before most people realize they have begun. There are no tales sung of battles that never happened, no statues raised for enemies who died before they could march. This absence of recognition is not accidental. It is doctrine. From their earliest indoctrination, Raven Guard aspirants are taught that to be noticed is to fail. A shadow that draws attention is no shadow at all. Over time, this philosophy seeps deeper than tactics and strategy, it becomes identity. When a warrior spends centuries ensuring that no one ever sees his face, hears his name, or remembers his actions, something within him begins to hollow out. The Raven Guard do not simply fight in silence, they live in it. There is a particular cruelty in this way of life. Other Space Marines endure horror, loss, and endless war, but they do so as symbols of imperial might. They are known, feared, and celebrated. The Raven Guard are denied even that small consolation. Their greatest successes are classified, erased, or attributed to others. They exist in after-action reports and sealed data vaults, not in legends. Over centuries, this breeds a quiet, corrosive question in the minds of their warriors. If no one knows what we have done, then what are we? This question haunts every Raven Guard battle brother, whether he dares to admit it or not. They are loyal beyond question, disciplined to the point of self-denial, yet deeply isolated even among their fellow Space Marines. Where others form loud, boisterous bonds of brotherhood, the Raven Guard favor distance and restraint. Not because they lack emotion, but because emotion is dangerous. Attachment can lead to hesitation, and hesitation can lead to exposure. In the shadows, hesitation is death. Their home world, their Primarch, and their history all reinforce this same brutal lesson. Freedom is never free, and survival often demands the sacrifice of one's own humanity. Long before the galaxy burned in betrayal and heresy, the Raven Guard learned that rebellion, stealth, and patience were the only tools available to the oppressed. These lessons would define them forever, carving a legion that excels at dismantling tyranny while quietly becoming prisoners of its own methods. And yet, despite everything, the Raven Guard endure. Not because they hope for recognition, or redemption, or peace, but because stopping would force them to confront the emptiness left behind by centuries of silence. They continue to fight not for glory, but because there is nothing else left for them to be. In a universe that devours the weak and the visible alike, they chose to become ghosts. This is the twisted life of the Raven Guard. A life lived in darkness, shaped by loss, and sustained by duty alone. A story not of how heroes rise, but of how they disappear, one silent victory at a time. If you stay with this story until the very end, you'll uncover not just the battles of the Raven Guard, but the quiet psychological truth that explains why they fight the way they do, and why no other Space Marine Legion could ever truly replace them. What lies ahead is not obvious, and the final revelation will change how you see loyalty, sacrifice, and survival in Warhammer 40K. Long before the Raven Guard became masters of shadow warfare, their identity was shaped by a place that knew nothing of mercy. Deliverance was not a proud world of banners and citadels. It was a prison moon, its skies choked with ash, its people reduced to numbered laborers working beneath the rule of distant, uncaring overseers. Freedom was a myth spoken only in whispers, and life was measured in shifts, quotas, and punishments. This was a world where obedience meant survival, and resistance meant death, slow, public, and deliberately terrifying. For the people of Deliverance, oppression was not an abstract concept. It was the weight of chains biting into flesh, the sound of boots echoing through steel corridors, the knowledge that individuality itself was a crime. Generations grew up learning to endure rather than to hope. Strength alone could not save you here. Rage only invited destruction. The only true weapon was patience, waiting, watching, learning the habits of your oppressors until the moment came to strike without warning. This environment left a permanent scar on the Legion that would call it home. When the Raven Guard drew their recruits from Deliverance, they did not find warriors hungry for glory. They found survivors. Men already trained by life to keep their heads down, their voices low, and their intentions hidden. These recruits did not need to be taught how to endure suffering or operate unseen. It was already instinct, etched into them by years of silent oppression. Even after becoming Space Marines, clad in power armor and gifted with superhuman strength, that mindset never faded. The Raven Guard did not see themselves as conquerors descending from the heavens. They saw themselves as liberators who knew, all too well, that liberation often comes at a terrible cost. Every mission, every kill, carried echoes of deliverance, reminders that power can become tyranny the moment it is seen as untouchable. This is why the Raven Guard do not seek dominance through spectacle. They do not crush worlds simply to prove they can. Instead, they dismantle enemy leadership, sabotage supply lines, and collapse regimes from within. To outsiders, their methods seem cold, even cowardly. But to those who understand Deliverance, these tactics are born from lived experience. They are the strategies of the enslaved, perfected and weaponized on a galactic scale. Yet there is a cruel paradox at the heart of this legacy. In learning how to destroy oppression quietly, the Raven Guard also learned how to erase themselves. Their culture prizes restraint over expression, obedience over individuality, duty over emotional release. Over centuries, this creates warriors who are incredibly effective, and deeply isolated. They save worlds that will never know their names, free populations that will never see their faces, and then vanish back into the dark. Deliverance taught them how to survive tyranny. The Imperium taught them how to enforce its will. Caught between those two truths, the Raven Guard became something rare and unsettling. Warriors who understand suffering so intimately that they choose to hide it, bury it, and carry it alone. And this is only the beginning of their tragedy. To understand the Raven Guard, you must understand the shadow that stands at their center, their primarch, Corvus Corax. His story does not begin with destiny or prophecy, but with captivity. When Corax first opened his eyes, he did so beneath the cold metal ceilings of Deliverance, a child born into a system designed to break spirits before they could ever rise. He did not grow among kings or warriors. He grew among prisoners, learning early that survival depended on silence, observation, and timing. Strength without thought meant nothing. Courage without patience meant death. Corax learned to hate oppression not as an idea, but as a lived reality. He watched men and women reduced to tools, worked until their bodies failed, then discarded without ceremony. Every injustice etched itself into him, shaping a primarch who would value freedom above all else, but freedom defined in a very specific way. To Corax, liberation was not about spectacle or celebration. It was about removing the boot from the neck, quietly, efficiently, before it could press down again. When he finally rose against the masters of deliverance, Corax did not do so as a conqueror. He became a symbol whispered through labor camps and factory levels, a presence felt more than seen. Revolts ignited not through open warfare, but through coordination, sabotage, and precision strikes. Leaders vanished. Systems failed. Authority collapsed from within. By the time open rebellion came, the battle was already decided. Deliverance was freed not by overwhelming force, but by intelligence, patience, and fear directed at the right targets. This philosophy carried over when the Emperor of Mankind finally found him. Corax recognized the Emperor's power instantly, but he also recognized the danger of it. Here was a being who spoke of unity and liberation, yet commanded armies capable of unimaginable destruction. Corax pledged loyalty, but it was not blind loyalty. It was conditional, rooted in a belief that the Imperium could be a shield against tyranny rather than its ultimate expression. This contradiction would haunt him for the rest of his existence. As Corax took command of the Raven Guard, he reshaped them in his own image. He discouraged excess, punished brutality, and rejected strategies that relied on indiscriminate slaughter. Where other legions glorified mass assaults and planetary annihilation, Corax demanded restraint. Every life taken had to serve a purpose. Every battle had to end quickly. To him, war was not a proving ground. It was a necessary evil to be concluded with minimal suffering. But there was a hidden cost to this idealism. By demanding perfection, Corax placed an impossible burden on his sons. They were not allowed the release of righteous fury or the comfort of visible victory. Mistakes were unacceptable. Collateral damage was failure. Over time, Raven Guard warriors internalized this pressure, becoming hyper-controlled, emotionally reserved, and increasingly isolated from their brother legions. They were not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting themselves. Corax believed he was sparing his legion from becoming monsters. In truth, he was creating something far more fragile. Warriors who carried guilt instead of pride. Soldiers who measured success by how little anyone noticed them. A legion that would win countless wars and feel none of the triumph. The Raven Guard became the Emperor's scalpel, sharp, precise, and always kept out of sight. And yet, for all his wisdom and restraint, Corax was still a primarch. He believed, deeply, that he could control the consequences of his choices. That his methods would protect his sons from the worst horrors of the galaxy. He was wrong. The galaxy does not reward subtlety forever, and soon, a betrayal would come that stealth alone could not escape. Because the shadows Corax mastered would one day betray him, and when they did, the Raven Guard would learn that even ghosts can bleed. As the Great Crusade surged across the galaxy, the Raven Guard moved at its edges, striking where resistance was strongest and least understood. While other legions descended like storms, shattering worlds through sheer force, the Raven Guard arrived as whispers. Their wars did not begin with orbital bombardments or massed formations. They began with silence. Communications failed. Commanders disappeared. Supply lines collapsed without explanation. By the time open conflict erupted, if it erupted at all, the enemy was already broken. To the Imperium, this made the Raven Guard invaluable. Entire systems were brought into compliance with minimal expenditure of lives and resources. Populations survived who would otherwise have been exterminated. On paper, their campaigns were triumphs of efficiency and restraint. But paper does not record hesitation, or doubt, or the moments between orders when a warrior wonders whether what he is doing truly serves humanity, or merely preserves an empire built on fear. The Raven Guard became executioners of necessity. Their targets were often not armies, but individuals, planetary governors, rebellious nobles, religious leaders, military strategists. They killed not because those targets fought them openly, but because their continued existence would lead to wider bloodshed. This kind of warfare demands a different kind of cruelty. Not the frenzy of battle, but the calm resolve to end a life without witnesses, without ceremony, and without certainty that history will ever justify it. Among the other legions, this made the Raven Guard unsettling. They did not boast of victories. They did not share stories of heroic last stands or overwhelming charges. When asked about their campaigns, their answers were brief, factual, and stripped of emotion. Over time, this created distance. Brotherhood among Space Marines thrives on shared glory and collective memory. The Raven Guard offered neither. They returned from war quieter than before, carrying experiences they could not easily explain, even to those who had fought beside them. Corax encouraged this distance, believing it protected his sons from arrogance and excess. But isolation has a way of feeding itself. Raven Guard warriors learned to rely only on their squads, then only on themselves. Trust became selective. Emotional expression became rare. In a legion already shaped by Deliverance's oppression, the Great Crusade reinforced the idea that survival meant self-containment. Feel nothing, reveal nothing, leave nothing behind. And yet, beneath that discipline, guilt accumulated. Every spared city was balanced against a silent assassination. Every minimized war required a calculated killing that could never be undone. The Raven Guard began to understand that there is no such thing as a clean war, only wars where the stains are hidden. This knowledge weighed on them, slowly eroding whatever sense of moral clarity they once possessed. Still, they pressed on. Because the Imperium demanded results, not reflections. Because hesitation meant disobedience. Because Corax believed, desperately, that this path was better than the alternatives. The Raven Guard continued to wage wars no one would celebrate, convinced that being forgotten was a fair price to pay for saving lives. They did not realize that this quiet suffering was only preparation, that the galaxy was about to teach them a far crueler lesson. One where stealth would fail, restraint would be meaningless, and silence would be answered with betrayal so loud it would shatter the Legion forever. The answer came at Istvaan V, a name that would forever stain the memory of the Raven Guard. Until that moment, they had believed, perhaps naively, that precision, loyalty, and restraint could shield them from the worst excesses of the Great Crusade. They trusted their brothers. They trusted the chain of command. They trusted that the Imperium, for all its brutality, still honored unity. All of those beliefs died in fire and betrayal. When the Raven Guard descended upon the ash-choked surface of Istvaan V, they did so with grim determination. This was not a shadow war, but an open confrontation against traitor legions who had turned on the Emperor. Even here, Corax sought to minimize unnecessary bloodshed. His legion was positioned to exploit weaknesses, to strike surgically once the enemy was pinned. They believed they were part of a coordinated assault. They believed reinforcements would arrive as planned. They were wrong. The moment the trap was sprung, stealth became meaningless. The skies burned as supposed allies revealed their true allegiance. Orbital fire rained down without discrimination, ripping through Raven Guard formations before they could reposition. Communications dissolved into static and screams. Warriors trained to operate unseen suddenly found themselves exposed, surrounded, and outnumbered. There is a particular horror in watching doctrine fail all at once, when everything you have trained for becomes useless in the space of a heartbeat. The Raven Guard fought with desperate resolve, but desperation is not a strategy. Entire companies were annihilated where they stood. Veterans who had survived countless covert campaigns died in open fields, cut down by overwhelming firepower. The legion that had perfected patience was forced into a slaughter it was never designed to endure. Shadows could not protect them from betrayal on this scale. For Corax, Istvaan V was more than a military disaster. It was a personal failure so profound that it reshaped his very being. He watched his sons die not because they were outmatched, but because they had trusted the Imperium's promise of unity. In that moment, Corax realized that restraint and loyalty had not spared his legion, they had made it vulnerable. The ideals he believed would protect his sons had led them straight into annihilation. Those who survived were changed forever. The Raven Guard emerged from Istvaan V as a shattered legion, reduced to a fraction of their former strength. The silence they had once chosen now surrounded them as a graveyard. Squads that once moved with quiet confidence now operated with haunted caution. Every order was questioned internally, every alliance viewed with suspicion. Trust, once broken, does not heal easily, especially among warriors who already lived in isolation. Istvaan V stripped away the last illusions the Raven Guard held about clean war and honorable unity. It taught them that in the galaxy they served, betrayal could be absolute and mercy could be fatal. The shadows they once mastered had betrayed them, revealing a truth far darker than any enemy they had faced before. And in the aftermath of that massacre, standing amid the ruins of his legion, Corax would make a decision born of guilt and desperation, a decision that would twist the Raven Guard even further, and ensure that their suffering was far from over. In the aftermath of Istvaan V, Corvus Corax faced a truth that no Primarch was ever meant to confront so directly. His legion was dying, and it was dying because of him. The Raven Guard were not merely depleted, they were broken. Too few remained to prosecute the wars the Imperium demanded, too scarred to believe in the ideals that had once guided them. Every silent victory they had achieved in the past felt meaningless against the scale of this loss. Precision had not saved them. Restraint had not protected them. And Corax could not accept that this was the end. Desperation has a way of eroding principles faster than any enemy ever could. Driven by guilt and a need to atone, Corax turned to knowledge that had been sealed away even from Primarchs. The Emperor's genetic archives held secrets never meant to be used in haste, unfinished work, unstable pathways, possibilities abandoned for good reason. Psychologically, the Legion continued to erode. The Raven Guard were not emotionless, but emotion was tightly controlled, buried beneath layers of discipline and conditioning. Guilt over past failures mixed with the constant pressure to never repeat them. Every operation carried the fear of exposure, the memory of betrayal, and the knowledge that one mistake could lead to annihilation. For a legion already shaped by oppression and loss, this mindset became suffocating. And yet, they endured. Because endurance was the one lesson Deliverance had taught them better than any other legion. They did not fight for praise, nor for belief in a brighter future. They fought because humanity needed someone willing to do what others would not, fight unseen, suffer unnoticed, and accept that their sacrifices would never be acknowledged. In a galaxy that devoured hope as easily as it devoured worlds, the Raven Guard learned to survive without either. They became experts at vanishing not just from enemy sensors, but from history itself. Entire campaigns would pass with only fragments recorded, their involvement classified or erased. To the Imperium, this was efficiency. To the Raven Guard, it was confirmation of what they had long suspected, that their existence was defined by absence. Still, there was no rebellion in them. No bitterness voiced aloud. Only a quiet, relentless continuation of duty. They would remain loyal even if loyalty offered nothing in return. Because to stop, to question too deeply, would mean facing the possibility that everything they had lost, including their Primarch, had been for nothing. And that was a truth even the Raven Guard were not ready to confront. As the Imperium staggered into the long nightmare of the post-heresy age, the Raven Guard found themselves shaped less by command and more by instinct. Centuries passed, then millennia, and their way of war became indistinguishable from their sense of self. Stealth was no longer merely a method, it was identity. Many Raven Guard no longer thought of themselves as warriors who used shadows. They thought of themselves as shadows that happened to fight. This transformation was subtle, almost invisible, but deeply corrosive. New initiates were trained not only to move unseen, but to feel most comfortable when no one was watching. Praise unsettled them. Attention felt dangerous. Even among allies, Raven Guard warriors instinctively positioned themselves at the edges of rooms, in half-light, observing rather than participating. They listened far more than they spoke, and when they did speak, every word was measured. Over time, this behavior ceased to be discipline and became preference. Their missions reflected this evolution. The Raven Guard specialized in wars that never truly ended, counter-insurgencies, suppression of heretical cults, surgical eliminations of enemy leaders who could not be allowed to inspire others. These were not glorious conflicts with clear beginnings and endings. They were slow, grinding struggles fought in alleys, hive depths, void stations, and forgotten moons. Victories came quietly, often indistinguishable from the background noise of the galaxy's endless violence. Emotionally, this existence demanded a terrible trade. To operate effectively, Raven Guard warriors learned to suppress attachment, to places, to people, even to one another. Bonds still formed, but they were restrained, muted, held at arm's length. Loss was frequent, and grief was internalized rather than shared. A fallen brother was honored silently, his name recorded, his absence absorbed without ceremony. There was no time for mourning in the shadows. The Imperium, for its part, was content to let this continue. The Raven Guard were too useful to question, too effective to scrutinize closely. Their operations were filed away under layers of classification, their casualties treated as acceptable losses in wars most citizens would never know existed. In this way, the Imperium mirrored the overseers of Deliverance all over again, distant, utilitarian, and indifferent to the individual cost of survival. Some within the Raven Guard understood this parallel all too clearly. They recognized that they had become what they once hated, instruments of control operating beyond accountability. But unlike their former oppressors, they did not revel in power. They accepted it with grim resignation. Someone had to do this work. Someone had to carry the weight of unseen violence so that others could live in ignorance of how fragile their safety truly was. This awareness twisted the Legion further inward. The Raven Guard did not ask whether the Imperium deserved their loyalty. They asked only whether abandoning it would cause greater suffering. And time and again, the answer was yes. So they remained, silent, invisible, necessary. In the darkness of the 41st millennium, the Raven Guard became something deeply unsettling, not because they were cruel, but because they were willing. Willing to be forgotten, willing to be feared if discovered, willing to lose pieces of themselves with every mission, so long as humanity endured a little longer. They were no longer chasing victory or redemption. They were managing decay. And somewhere, deep within the warp, their lost Primarch watched from the shadows, changed, distant, and no longer certain that even he could save what his legion had become. Corvus Corax, once the guiding light and shadow of the Raven Guard, had long since become something else entirely. He no longer moved among his sons, did not walk the halls of warships or speak in quiet council. Instead, he wandered the warp, hunting traitors and seeking vengeance in a place where time and space twisted upon themselves. The galaxy had changed him. The betrayal at Istvaan V, the deaths of countless sons, and the horrors of his own failed experiments had carved away the Primarch he had once been. What remained was a shadow of conviction, sharpened into something both unstoppable and isolated. Even in the warp, Corax could not escape the weight of his choices. Every plan he enacted, every traitor slain, reminded him of what he had left behind. The Raven Guard were no longer a unified force under his guidance, they were ghosts scattered across a galaxy indifferent to their suffering. Their victories were silent, their losses invisible, and their struggle unrecorded. And yet, he remained connected to them in ways no one else could perceive, feeling their pain, their isolation, and their relentless perseverance as if it were his own. The legion that he had shaped was now a legion of loners. Each warrior carried not only the physical scars of battles fought and survived, but the psychological weight of centuries of unseen violence. They were hunters, spies, and assassins who preferred silence over camaraderie, solitude over celebration. Over time, this became not only habit but identity. Many could no longer imagine a life outside the shadows. To emerge into the light was frightening, almost unnatural. And yet, despite the growing alienation within themselves, the Raven Guard continued to fight, because stopping would force them to confront the depth of their loss, the depth of the void left by a father who could not return. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was a slow corrosion, a layering of despair and discipline that molded the Raven Guard into something uniquely terrifying. They had become less like warriors and more like inevitabilities, silent arbiters of death who existed to maintain balance in a galaxy that could not recognize their contributions. Their enemies feared them, but even their allies understood little of the cost. Those who survived Istvaan V were forever marked, carrying the legacy of that betrayal in every step, every strike, every whisper of movement that preceded their attack. The Raven Guard had become a legion where shadow was not just a tactic, it was a necessity, a philosophy, and a prison. They operated within the imperceptible spaces between conflict and consequence, between obedience and rebellion, between survival and sacrifice. And through it all, Corax continued his eternal vigilance, ensuring that the few who remained would endure. Not because glory awaited them, nor honor, nor even peace, but because someone had to carry the burden no one else could bear. And so, the Raven Guard persist. Invisible, uncelebrated, and inexorably bound to the shadows that define them. Their lives are a testament to endurance, but also a warning. In a universe that rewards the seen and the loud, sometimes the greatest power, and the deepest tragedy, lies in being unseen. In the long centuries following the heresy, the Raven Guard had become something few could fully understand. They were no longer simply a chapter of Space Marines, they were an idea made flesh, a principle of existence embodied in armor and skill. Stealth, precision, and detachment were no longer mere tools of war. They were the very essence of what it meant to be Raven Guard. The longer the Legion endured, the more inseparable their way of fighting became from the way they lived. To step outside their doctrines was to invite disaster. To ignore it was unthinkable. Their campaigns continued across countless worlds, often forgotten even by the Imperium itself. Civil uprisings were crushed with calculated strikes, heretical cults were dismantled before they could organize, warlords and tyrants eliminated in silence. Each operation reinforced a dangerous truth: the Raven Guard existed to act where others could not, and in doing so, they were rarely seen, rarely known, and rarely remembered. They fought not for glory, but because the galaxy demanded invisible guardians. Yet this necessity came with a psychological toll that grew heavier with each passing century. Warriors became increasingly withdrawn, emotionally guarded to the point of alienation. Brotherhood, once a cornerstone of Space Marine life, became a distant concept. Training and discipline were no longer preparation for war, they were survival mechanisms for enduring existence itself. In their minds, exposure meant vulnerability, and attachment meant risk. Every connection carried potential pain, every alliance potential betrayal. Slowly, the Raven Guard were transformed into a legion of isolated ghosts, each member a solitary figure moving through the shadows of the Imperium. Even amidst these adaptations, a strange resilience emerged. While other chapters might falter under isolation or tragedy, the Raven Guard endured. Their understanding of suffering and loss became a weapon in itself. They could operate for decades, even centuries, under conditions that would break most other Space Marines. They embraced the idea that pain and invisibility were tools, that discipline could become instinct, and that survival required detachment. In doing so, they mastered the art of silent endurance. But there was a hidden cost to this mastery. A legion shaped entirely by duty and isolation could no longer define itself by personal ideals, joy, or hope. Their victories were uncelebrated, their losses ungrieved. Over time, the Raven Guard began to blur the line between their missions and themselves. Shadow was no longer just a tactic, it became identity, and identity became obligation. They fought because to stop would be to confront a universe that had already taken everything from them: comrades, guidance, and the possibility of being known. The Raven Guard had become both necessary and tragic. They were the Imperium's invisible hand, shaping outcomes no one would ever recognize, and yet this very invisibility had transformed them into something almost inhuman. Their loyalty was absolute, their efficiency unmatched, but their humanity, the warmth, the bonds, the freedom to exist without duty, had been stripped away. And in this quiet, relentless existence, they discovered the most unsettling truth of all. In a galaxy that worships heroes, sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who are never seen. Corvus Corax, though wandering the warp, remained tethered to his sons in ways no other could comprehend. Though he had abandoned the Raven Guard physically, his consciousness stretched across the stars, sensing their suffering, their victories, and their solitude. He became a silent guardian, a specter of guidance, never able to intervene directly, never able to comfort them in person. His absence was both a curse and a protection, a reminder that even the strongest could fail, and that even the most loyal needed to endure without rescue. The legion he left behind adapted in his absence, but at a cost. Chapters became autonomous, strategies decentralized, and squads dispersed. They were masters of survival, yet increasingly fragmented. Each operative bore not just the burden of battle, but the weight of living without a guiding hand. They carried the memory of his lessons, precision, restraint, and patience, but without his presence to temper them, these principles became rigid, unyielding doctrines. Flexibility gave way to strict adherence, and obedience became a shield against chaos both external and internal. This separation intensified the isolation already embedded in the Legion's DNA. Many Raven Guard no longer formed bonds beyond immediate squads. Trust was earned in whispers and actions, never assumed. New initiates grew up understanding that attachment was a liability, that sentimentality was weakness, and that duty alone was their path to survival. Over centuries, this cultivated a legion of warriors who were emotionally distant, morally disciplined, and painfully self-reliant. Their humanity was preserved only insofar as it did not interfere with their function. Their identities became inseparable from their missions. Even so, the Raven Guard continued to fight. Their campaigns spanned the Imperium, striking quietly against rebellion, heresy, and corruption. They remained indispensable, yet invisible, their deeds recorded in classified logs and forgotten annals. Victory was never celebrated, loss was never mourned, and history largely ignored them. They existed in the cracks of the Imperium, performing a role no one else could fulfill, carrying the burden of survival that came at the expense of recognition, connection, and sometimes even their own sense of self. Through it all, the shadow of Corax lingered. His influence remained, not in command structures or spoken orders, but in the enduring culture he had imprinted upon the Legion. They followed the principles he had instilled, but they also carried the silent lesson of failure, that even the strongest, most intelligent, and most principled could not shield their sons from the cruelty of the galaxy. This awareness haunted every step they took, reinforcing their reliance on shadows, solitude, and meticulous preparation. In the end, the Raven Guard became a legion of loners not out of choice, but necessity. They were defined by what they did, not by who they were. And while Corax hunted endlessly in the warp, his sons walked the material universe carrying a silent truth: the greatest warriors are often those who exist in the spaces between, who fight unrecognized, and who endure because no one else can. The Raven Guard continued through the centuries not as a celebrated chapter, but as a force defined by endurance, discipline, and an almost unnatural comfort with invisibility. Their lives were no longer measured by victories or glory, but by the very fact that they continued to exist in a galaxy that would otherwise have destroyed them. Each mission was a testament to survival, each calculated strike a reminder that their value was measured not by recognition, but by necessity. They were guardians of humanity who could not be acknowledged, soldiers whose triumphs remained unknown. Over time, stealth became more than strategy, it became identity. Raven Guard warriors moved with the instinct of shadows, reacting before they were seen, disappearing before they could be confronted. To step into the light was dangerous, almost unnatural. Recognition was a threat, emotional bonds a liability, and hesitation a luxury they could no longer afford. In living this way, the Legion had effectively merged their purpose with their existence. To fight invisibly was to live, and to live was to fight invisibly. There was no separation between who they were and what they did. Isolation hardened further. Interactions with other chapters were brief, measured, and often uneasy. Allies respected their efficiency but remained wary of their silence and intensity. The Raven Guard did not engage in casual camaraderie, did not share victories, and rarely spoke of failure. Even within their own ranks, communication was functional, stripped of sentiment, governed by necessity and caution. Bonds existed, but they were contained within the narrow confines of squads and operations, never allowed to expand beyond the imperatives of survival. Yet, despite this isolation, the Raven Guard remained indispensable. They struck where enemies believed themselves safe, dismantled threats quietly, and carried out campaigns that allowed billions to survive without ever knowing their names. Their methods were surgical, brutal, and precise, but above all, invisible. And with every success, the paradox of their existence deepened. They preserved life and stability while sacrificing their own humanity, their own recognition, and sometimes even their own sanity. The Raven Guard had become a paradox of the Imperium, the most loyal, most capable, and most necessary warriors, yet almost entirely removed from the history and glory that defined other legions. They were the shadows of the Emperor's will, moving unseen across a galaxy of fire and death. Survival was not their reward, it was their burden. And yet, they endured, because no one else could. In embracing invisibility, they had become more than warriors, they had become a force of nature, silent, unrelenting, and almost mythic. And while the galaxy forgot them, they never forgot themselves, or the lesson that survival, above all, exacts its price in solitude, silence, and sacrifice. By this point in their history, the Raven Guard had become something almost unrecognizable to outsiders. They were no longer merely a Space Marine Legion, they were an embodiment of restraint, isolation, and relentless precision. Time had eroded any semblance of emotional openness, leaving warriors who were defined as much by their detachment as by their martial skill. Their victories remained unrecorded, their losses ungrieved, and yet they continued to operate, because to stop was to confront the unbearable reality of what they had endured, and what they had lost. Each operative carried within them a layered history of trauma and survival. Istvaan V remained a shadow over their minds, a constant reminder that even the most disciplined and loyal could be betrayed in an instant. Corax's absence hung over them like a silent verdict, an ever-present question: how could they survive, and yet remain true to the principles of the father they had lost? The answer they found was simple, brutal, and unavoidable: by becoming shadows themselves. Their missions, their tactics, and even their identities were inseparable from the darkness in which they operated. Over centuries, this way of life hardened into instinct. Raven Guard warriors moved through the galaxy as hunters and guardians, acting where others could not, striking when no one was looking, and disappearing before anyone could react. They became attuned to silence, to absence, and to the smallest disturbances in their environment. Recognition became a danger. Emotion became a liability. Attachment became unthinkable. And yet, they endured, because endurance was the only thing that mattered. The Imperium itself rarely noticed, and when it did, it was often with unease.